Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this event. My name is Emmett O'Brien, and I am a fourth-year undergraduate student at the university, and I serve as the Vice President of the International Relations Organization at UVA. IRO has served as a student-led forum for the discussion of pressing global issues for over 50 years and is today one of UVA's most active CIOs. As Vice President, I organize our public programming, which offers insights from former policymakers, Q&A sessions with leading professors at the university, and career advice for future public servants. On behalf of IRO, I would like to thank the Miller Center and the Batten School for sponsoring this event, and in particular, thank you to Chris Liu for turning this panel from an idea on a Zoom call into a reality. Ambassador Liu will have more to say in his introductory remarks about our panelists and the topic of their discussion today, but I want to first briefly emphasize the importance of students participating in and taking a leadership role in public programming such as this, especially on such a pressing topic as the regulation of artificial intelligence and its role in our society. I'm sure that at some point most students here have heard a visiting speaker tell us in response to a question about the threat of climate change, rising economic inequality, the fraying rules-based international order, or in this case, the rise of AI, that our generation must rise to the challenges posed by these problems. And it's easy to forget that the events where we ask these questions are not tangential or a sideshow to taking real action on these problems. In fact, the conversations here are essential. Here, experts and leaders can propose new ideas and test them against competing arguments, honing them into viable, actionable solutions. Especially at a university so dedicated to developing citizen leaders, students cannot just be passive audience members. If we are to take responsibility for solving the world's problems, we must first take responsibility to foster discussion and debate. My basic point here is twofold. Events such as this one are important, and students should take on important tasks. The Miller Center, especially Ambassador Liu, deserve immense credit for making this important event happen and for working closely with students in the development, organization, and execution of this idea. If any of you want to participate in or be leaders in conversations such as this, the Miller Center and IRO always have our doors open. Thank you.
For each of us?
Yeah. Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Liu. I am the Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the University of Virginia Miller Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's discussion, Regulating AI in a Fragmented World. Who sets the rules? First, let me thank the Batten School and the International Relations Organization for co-sponsoring this event with us. AI is rapidly reshaping everything from national security and economic competitiveness to the future of work, education, and healthcare. The technology is advancing rapidly, and governments around the world are grappling with how to regulate technologies that are evolving faster than traditional regulatory systems can handle. In the United States, we're in a particularly dynamic moment. The Trump administration has rolled back voluntary guardrails developed during the Biden administration in the name of promoting innovation and maintaining U.S. technological leadership. Congress has yet to pass comprehensive federal AI legislation. As a result, both red states and blue states are moving ahead with their own AI approaches. In response, President Trump has issued an executive order attempting to significantly restrict states from independently regulating AI. The international leadership is also shifting. Landscape is shifting. The European Union is reconsidering aspects of the AI regulatory framework. China is advancing a very different model of governance for AI, and institutions like the United Nations are working to ensure that the benefits of AI reach developing countries rather than deepen global inequalities. So the question is not simply whether AI will be regulated, but who will set those rules and whose values will be embedded in those rules. Today, we're fortunate to have a panel that reflects the different arenas where those debates will take place: government, academia, and the private sector. We'll explore several tensions shaping this governance debate: innovation versus regulation, uniformity versus experimentation, national competitiveness versus global norms. Let me briefly introduce our terrific panelists, starting on my left. Astrid Kimball Van Dyke is Director of Google's Global Competition Policy Team. Her tenure in government in the Obama administration includes serving as Deputy Counsel to Vice President Biden and also working at the White House Office of Cabinet Affairs in the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Seth Center is a Senior Fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. From 2023 to 2025, Seth served as the Acting Special Envoy for Critical and Emerging Technologies at the U.S. Department of State. He received his PhD in Diplomatic History from UVA and was also once a Fellow at the Miller Center. And Alan Stamm is University Professor of Public Policy and Politics here at the Batten School and a Miller Center Faculty Senior Fellow. Alan is currently teaching a class on AI and has kindly incorporated today's event into his curriculum. So thank you to his students and all the other students here today. Let me set the stage with the conversation, and I will start with Seth. You're not only a diplomat, you're not only an expert on technology, you're also a historian. When historians look at this moment in the development of AI, what analogy can they turn to? Is this the Industrial Revolution, the nuclear age, internet, globalization? What's the closest analogy that we can come to? And in those other moments, what did policymakers get right and what did they get wrong?
Great. Thanks, Chris, and I appreciate you having me down. Emmett, great job introducing us. As Chris said, first of all, I did get a graduate degree here at UVA, and one of my formative experiences was working at the Miller Center. And one of my great advisors, Mel Leffler, is here in the audience from the history department. And most importantly, of all of my UVA connections, I met my wife here, and we were married here. And so the lesson for the students in the audience is be very careful, because UVA could shape the rest of your life in determinative ways. You never know. So it's great. It's great to be back. Chris, you can think about AI and history in a few different ways. Is this a text box in the textbook on AI? Is this a paragraph in a chapter on AI? Is this a chapter on AI? Is it a book on AI? Or is it a whole series defining an era? I think someone like Henry Kissinger or Eric Schmidt, who have written extensively about AI, see it as analogous to the Enlightenment, a full series of historical books capturing an entire epic. I think if you're looking at this through the lens of the relationship between AI and applications to military, it's perhaps a chapter in a history of military and technology. The way I would think about it is the way Thomas Edison talked about electricity at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And he said, electricity is a field of fields. It's going to redefine the way in which we live in all kinds of unexpected and unanticipated ways. And the reason why that's interesting is this is 20 years after he comes up with the light bulb, but 30 years before we have full grid national regulation for electricity in the United States. And in 1900, when he makes this observation, there's no way to understand the way in which electricity is going to spawn all kinds of follow-on innovation that's going to transform our lives, society, warfare, politics, and balance of power. So that's the way I would think about it. Now, the people who believe most fervently that AI is truly transformative, that it's like an enlightenment epic of human history, would argue AI is unlike any historical analog, unlike any other technology in history, because it does not bring energy. It does not the creation of a single device. It is the generation of creativity and new knowledge, which is something in which we have no frame of reference. I see it more in the book, not the epic, but that's the kind of lens in which I think about it.
Alan, let me get your take as a political scientist. Political systems often struggle to respond to disruptive technologies. Would love to get your take on, in this historical moment, what analogy we can draw to that can best capture the challenges that government faces with AI, and should we be concerned that democratic institutions can move slower or often move slower than technological change?
Yeah, thanks. And to follow on Seth, thanks everybody for coming. We really appreciate having being up here. We always appreciate having people to talk with. And thank you for joining us here in Charlottesville. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I think about the question in a couple of different ways. Slightly differently than Seth, I think about, what are the groups that are most highly affected or impacted by AI, and then look at what are the analogies to, and I suppose as a political scientist. And the group that came to mind were the Luddites in the early 1800s. And the Luddites were a group of machinists and wool makers in England. It ended up being a much larger group, but they were very highly skilled people. And they were concerned that there would be these machines that would come along, not just that it would replace their jobs, but that the output from the machines wasn't as good as what these skilled weavers could do. And so I think that if we look at, from a democratic perspective, if we look at what's driving anxiety amongst potential voters, part of it, a big part, is the issue of potential job replacements, of how will AI interact with social media to affect our children, through screen time, how schooling is a huge part of people's lives, and how is AI going to affect education, our kids' schools, my college students' lives. And the challenge in a democracy is, in most of these revolutions in the past, the Enlightenment was a sort of century-long process, and the political institutions themselves could evolve to a significant extent, not perfectly, but along with the changing technology. The Industrial Revolution brought with it and was affected by political evolution. And the problem we face today is that we've hit this exponential change. And again, if you're an advocate, a booster, an optimist, we're basically strapping into a rocket ship and it's going to be amazing. If you're super pessimistic, you see the pace of change. So just by a personal example, I got asked to teach this class on AI policy. I worked it all out in December because the class started in January. And then Claude Code was introduced, and OpenClaw was introduced, and agentic software actually became something that you could do in the space of 2 weeks. And so all of a sudden I realized, wow, I got to redesign half of my class because of something that changed in the space of 2 weeks. And the problem is the technology is evolving and changing faster, I think, than our institutions can. But people's expectations and the demand for institutional change can keep up almost as quickly as the technology. And so I think our democratic institutions are stuck a little bit, which creates demand for some of the more pernicious political changes we've seen maybe over the last few years.
So let's take this from the historical and philosophical to the real world. Oscar, you're at Google, which is one of the leading companies that's developing AI. And as a company in a largely unregulated or not regulated significantly environment, a company like Google has great power and great responsibility. How is the company thinking about its own roles and responsibilities in this moment?
Thank you, and thanks for having me. We're thinking profoundly about our responsibility, and Google's mission since its founding has been to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible. That's the basic mission, and AI is a hugely important part of that. When we talk about AI, we talk about being bold and responsible, and making sure that the benefits of AI reach as many people as possible. And Google has been an AI-first company for a few years. So AI is already very much a part of our products. But the pace of change in my 12 years at Google, it blows away anything. I mean, to your point, the example of OpenClaw and agents and what we're seeing week to week with the development of agents, how the models are becoming more efficient. Will the models need data centers or be on device? It's extremely fast-paced, extremely exciting. And I think it's really uncertain, which is, I think, why we all need to be part of we need government, we need the private sector, we need the public ecosystem to be part of the conversation about where do we want this technology to go, what should it do? And from Google's perspective, we have long said AI is too important not to be regulated. Our CEO had that op-ed in the FT a few years ago saying that. We think it needs to be regulated. And we can get into this more a bit later, but when we talk about AI regulations, I couldn't agree with you more. The analogy to electricity is a really apt one, because when we talk about AI, what layer of the AI stack are we talking about? We're people talk about, when I think of the AI stack, we think of it as chips. NVIDIA is certainly an AI company, but they're not doing large models, they're doing chips. We think of it as the infrastructure, the data centers. We think of it as the large models. So things like Google, Gemini, OpenAI, Anthropic's Claude, DeepSeek, those are the large models. There are smaller models. Then there's the training level of the stack. Then there's the grounding level of the stack. Then there's the deployment. You mentioned your class is doing the apps, and whether those are apps or agents, there are all these different levels of the stack, and they might all require a different kind of regulation. How AI is used in health may be very different regulatory questions than how it's used in energy or how it's used in war. So I think when we talk about AI and regulation, we should be thinking about what we mean. And I also just wanted to say, from when you talk about Google and how we think about our responsibility, we're not waiting for regulation. We've called for regulation, we believe in regulation, but we know that we need to keep our users' trust. And so on things like watermarking AI, to be transparent about what is AI and what isn't, our own policies around AI, how we use it in our products, but how and what we allow on our platforms. We're not waiting, because we feel the real market imperative to have high standards and make our products a place where our users want to be.
I want to talk now about, and by the way, I should say, if you're watching on the live stream, you can submit questions through the Q&A function. And then when we get to the audience questions, there's a mic over here, and I'll let you know if folks can start queuing up with questions. But we're going to probably go another half hour, 40 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. I want to talk about what the implications are in a couple of different areas, given the fragmented regulatory or non-regulatory system we have. Seth, you were one of the main tech diplomats during the last administration. You know that there at least was a Chinese, there is a Chinese model of regulation, there's a European model of regulation, there's maybe an American model of something, not regulation. Are we moving to a world of fragmented regulation, or should we try to strive for more international norms?
First of all, you and I were shoulder to shoulder on some of these conversations, so feel free to correct me when I'm wrong. I'm much less concerned about regulatory fragmentation than I think many people are, for a few different reasons. One is the experience that we had in the U.S. government. We went out into the world and started having conversations with other governments about how they were thinking about this. What struck us is we started with the premise that advanced AI systems needed a governance structure which was somewhat unique from previous conversations about regulation of digital technologies. And then we built on that premise a series of assumptions that technology companies building advanced AI models had a series of baseline safety and governance consensus around things like red teaming systems, transparency, model cards, making sure they were deployed societal good, making sure that information is shared with government on national security risks that would transcend political systems, that would transcend geography. And by and large, when we would go out and talk to different governments, developing world governments, European governments, Asian governments, they would basically say, yeah, that is the right foundation for a governance structure. Where there was tension that emerged, it was the question not of the governance framework or the principles around which you would build that governance framework, but how you would implement a legal regime to translate that governance framework into either mandatory or voluntary compliance. The Europeans got way out ahead of the technology beginning in 2021 when they started to develop an AI Act. This is prior to the ChatGPT revolution, prior to the Gen AI hitting. And suddenly, as the convergence of their law hit this massive technological acceleration, a bunch of countries got buyer's remorse. And they started to try and walk back this tight regulatory regime, which is going to have legal compliance for the technology. And they're still, Chris, as you alluded to, trying to figure out how to navigate a much more permissive environment. The Chinese are an interesting situation because they have the most heavily regulated model environment of any country in the world. But within it, they have a radically permissive environment for innovation of technology. So they have both going on at the same time. What the Chinese do not do or have any model for is exporting that governance regime abroad. So when we had direct government-to-government conversations with the Chinese government about the nature of AI safety and risk, they had no interest in talking about the nature of the domestic governance or the domestic regulations whatsoever. And Chris, as you know, at the UN, they had really no interest in propagating their domestic model of AI governance into an international system. And so what we have in front of us actually is a fairly clear path to developing a governance framework around what I think are shared principles, largely driven by advanced AI companies, reflected largely through US principles that I think we can get pretty substantial consensus around.
Can I ask, you remember well, there was a conversation that was started by the Secretary General of the UN that said we should look at AI like we look at atomic energy. It should be something that has both harmful purposes and good purposes, and there needs to be an international framework for how we deal with that. That's not the US approach, but do you think that there's some analogy there?
So, first of all, that is not the US approach of the Biden administration, nor the Trump administration, nor any future administration. I'm quite confident. The analogy of the IAEA breaks down very quickly if one starts to unpack what the IAEA was, what the timeframes were, what it was trying to control. Artificial intelligence is not a material, it's not containable in any way. It is already, models are diffused around the world. They are not, there is no possible way to control or govern them out of an international multilateral body. The idea, as I said, that there could be shared principles around which each country could develop a regulatory regime is entirely possible, but the IAEA is not the right framework. And Chris, as you know, even if you use that as a useful analogy, it's only useful in reminding people that it took about 15 years to go from concept to operation to get the IAEA going. So if we want to go down that path, we're in, say, 1952, the IAEA is not going to get going in a functional way for 10 more years. So there has to be a huge amount of patience. You can't force an international regime.
Austria, I want to talk about the implications of this fragmented world that we live in for innovation from a company's perspective. In Washington, this debate gets framed in terms of innovation and regulation as a dichotomy. Is that a false dichotomy?
I think it is. Yeah. I think that you need regulation, good regulation, to have innovation. The years I've worked at Google, I can't tell you the number of governments, let's see, I've been to 18 countries for Google, people who say, how do I have a Silicon Valley? How do I build that in my country? And it's not just me, it's Eric Schmidt, you mentioned him earlier, our former chairman and an engineer. His answer always was, it's not, you have to have good engineers, good talent, but it's also the legal system that's put into place that helps, the regulatory system that helps the innovation flourish. And from where we're sitting right now with AI, I think we do want some certainty, and we do, so from a company's perspective, having certainty around regulation helps innovation, and knowing, I can say I work a lot on Europe right now, and there's a lot of uncertainty around what kinds of AI innovations we can integrate into our existing products in Google Search, for example. And so in some European countries, we haven't rolled out our latest AI because of that uncertainty, and that we would love to be in those countries with these products, but we haven't, and so because of the uncertainty. So that's not a good situation for our users.
Alan, let me ask you about this fragmented system and the implications for trust. You look at every public opinion poll, Americans are skeptical, some even fearful about what AI means. Weirdly, Americans are more fearful than people in other countries. And there's a sense that they want government to step in, and yet there is a gap between what they want and what government does. Is that just the slowness of the political process, or is this really something that's very hard to get your arms around, particularly when policymakers don't completely understand the implications?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's super complicated. It depends in part upon what our panelists said, what layer of the stack you're talking about. So you have local concerns. Somebody has a data center coming into their neighborhood. There's a set of political concerns about that, and I think that those types of questions are pretty easy to understand in standard politics. There are the employment aspects of it in terms of sort of what we might think of as white collar or knowledge workers that are concerned about their jobs being replaced. From a regulatory perspective, we have electricity, we have water, jobs. But if we look at the data, I think in the United States, the concerns are growing faster because the technology to a significant extent has emerged from the United States. And many of the big companies exist or headquartered in the United States. I was just looking at some Pew Trust data on this yesterday. And so it's about 50-50 in the United States. About half of Americans are antagonistic, terrified, concerned, worried about developments of AI, thinking about it in sort of like what these tools can do for us. And half of people are optimistic and bullish. And the really interesting thing was you dig down into those data, though, the more that people interact with the models,
Absolutely.
the more supportive they are. The people that are most hostile to the AI models have seen it used by somebody else but haven't used it themselves. And so I think in terms of, again, the timing aspect's a big deal. The ability of our institutions to keep up with the pace of change. I don't think you can say often enough that there's a disconnect there. But I think we want to be super clear about it's a very complex system that's creating this very sort of targeted technology. And I don't think there's widespread understanding yet about, so if we think about data centers, for example, if you ask unions, machinist unions, pipe fitters unions, on the one hand, they're all in on it because it's an incredible source of jobs. At the same time, they think it's bonkers because they've never built facilities this big that didn't flame out. And so the interviews with those folks go very differently than people that may be sort of using this to improve their productivity working for McKinsey or Deloitte. And so it's a highly fragmented system. People's opinions are all over the place, and our political institutions aren't quite yet up to the task. The last thing I'll say that, so governors and presidents have tried to pick up the ball, the Biden administration, the Trump administration, and they have yet to work out, particularly the current administration, a cooperative relationship with either state legislatures or Congress to do something sort of cooperatively that would bring in industry, that would bring in representatives from labor and consumer organizations.
So let me jump to the next, you anticipated my next set of questions. So in this absence of federal regulation right now, we could argue it's not just in AI, it's data privacy. There's a whole suite of technological changes that Washington has not been able to get in front of. States are now stepping in. As I said at the introduction, you've got California, you've got legislation in Virginia that Governor Youngkin vetoed, you've got Texas, Florida. It's red states and blue states. We often, I guess in political science, we talk about the laboratory of democracy, we talk about experimentation. Is in this arena, is that experimentation a good thing or a bad thing?
This is the most unpalatable answer. The answer is it depends. So if you're Google, I suspect you could confirm that you'd want a common regulatory framework so you don't have to deal with 50 different models. The flip side is there's a lot of heterogeneity across our states, both politically and from an infrastructure perspective, from an employment perspective. And so we would want, again, depending on one's perspective, you would embrace that heterogeneity. The Trump administration has issued an executive order saying, in a fairly imperial or imperious way, we're in charge, the states, either legislature or executive orders, we supersede those. Courts have been systematically unsympathetic to that. If it's Congress passing legislation, Constitution says Congress wins, with a few notable exceptions. Executive orders, however, the courts have said typically, not always, but typically, legislatures carry the day, so state legislatures in that instance will carry the day. So I think until Congress is able to come together on this, we're going to, for better or for worse, again, it depends on where you sit, we're going to continue to see this heterogeneity across the states.
So let me, and Seth, let me ask you about this, because during the Biden administration, the approach was essentially going to the companies, getting a set of voluntary commitments, and then trying to normalize those voluntary guardrails. Is that about as far as we can possibly go, or do you think there's something more prescriptive that we can do here in the United States?
So I think, first of all, that's not actually an unusual approach to governing an early technological development, where those who are developing, commercializing, utilizing those technologies get together and start to self-police and lay out what is and isn't acceptable. And then the transparency by which that is projected into the public domain creates pressure on shareholders, pressure in politics, to some degree of self-regulation. To go further than that, well, look, I'm not going to domestic regulation or the other, but it's going to have to be domain. I think largely it's going to have to be domain specific. So AI through the lens of medical devices, AI through the lens of how it applies to transportation. That when the challenge that I think people are struggling with in the United States and elsewhere is, what is the regulatory responsibility for model developers? So the premise is this technology is general purpose. The knowledge that is generated out of the underlying model can apply across domains, and therefore the liability, responsibility, and regulation must fall on the developer itself. This is going to be incredibly difficult to come up with a legal regime to shape that in a way that continues to allow the United States to lead in the technology and allows our companies to continue to innovate. That's what I think we're wrestling with right now.
All right, Astrid, let me put this back on you. I started this by saying companies like Google have great power and responsibility. You've talked about how you all have internal standards. Sometimes, like in the Biden administration, those standards get codified into voluntary rules, norms. You all are essentially setting the rules right now. Is that a good thing? I mean, should the public trust that?
I mean, I think there are some things that there are regulations around. I think we have to keep earning the public's trust every day, and we understand the questions about this. We understand the anxiety about jobs. We understand the anxiety about data centers, existential risk. I mean, these are real questions, privacy, surveillance, that we have been dealing with in the context of search, but AI is raising new questions. That's why we all need to be talking about it. I agree with you completely. We need to be using the products. What really worries me is the gap growing between people who are using these products and people who don't want to try them and don't want to, and because it's here. And I think, one example I would use of Google from its own policies having a really significant positive impact on the field is we've always chosen to be open source in our approach to AI. And I think this is actually something people should be talking a lot when they talk about the future of AI, the open versus closed. As you say, the OpenClaw developments have risen that in a different way. And so Google, part of Google called DeepMind, created something called AlphaFold, which was looked at how to map proteins and had been a grand prize challenge for scientists for decades. And AI helped us build this database of mapping proteins the head of Google DeepMind actually won a Nobel Prize for it last year because of the significant contributions this makes to science. We've made that database open source, and 3 million scientists from over 120 countries use it regularly to build and advance science and advance research. And that kind of choice that a company makes to be open source, to lean into that, I think is something that we should be celebrating and talking about. I think that we don't want, though, the just trust us, like let the company set the rule. We do, as I said, we do want smart regulation. And just a word on what that would look like. I agree with you, Seth. It is hard. I think it could be principles-based, that is not tied to only specific products. The area I work on, competition policy, there is a rush and a temptation to regulate chatbots, for example. There was the temptation to regulate email or search engines. And I've seen massive laws be passed around search engines. And now you could say, is a chatbot a search engine or not? And are those laws already out of date? So I think sort of having principles that are timeless is an important way for this for legislation to be grounded in that.
So I want to go to a recent example of where a company stepped up with its own values. And Seth asked you about the recent dispute between the Defense Department and Anthropic, where Anthropic says you can't use our technology because it can't be used for surveillance, it can't be used for autonomous weapons. I mean, is that the future? Companies are the ones that are going to have to step up. And if everything, I mean, obviously we've talked a lot about ethics and trust. If you view everything in the national security lens, does that conversation about trust and safety get lost?
So I think the answer is no. I think there are domain-specific applications of AI which are going to be essential to the national security of the United States for the future. They're going to become more persuasive and consequential. And I think one of the interesting issues, and I was a part of something called the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence to look at the implications of AI and national security a few years ago. One of the things that most of the people in the AI community don't fully appreciate coming out of Silicon Valley is the extent to which the national security community has extensive testing and evaluation processes for all of its hardware and software before it gets put into deployment. And so the tension between safety and risk and acceleration is one that doesn't actually concern me that much. I think the flip side has always been a much larger concern, which is why aren't the national security apparatuses using technologies that are widely available commercially more effectively to protect us? Now, there's a unique situation here with the case you alluded to, Chris. What's interesting here is the great challenge that the military has had over the past several years is to adopt AI. Part of the reason has been historically the reluctance of AI companies to work in close connection with the national security community because AI developers have not always been oriented nationally. Google had an unfortunate misstep several years ago that they corrected. Anthropic hurtled into the national security breach before any other AI company to make its model available to the national security community. It did so in a way that comported with all of the rules, regulations, standards, testing, evaluation of the national security community. And so I think by and large it was in quite a good position as a test bed for how these applications are going to develop and evolve responsibly in the future. It appears that two things are going on in this particular situation. One, of course, is a larger political question of the relationship between the company and the government. And the second is how companies would operate in theoretical, hypothetical situations in the future. Now, Chris, you've worked in government, Esther, you've worked in government. It's very hard for government lawyers to work through how hypothetical responses would work in a contractual sense. And so I can sort of understand how the government's view on this could take shape. On the other side, you've seen amicus briefs from many of the other AI companies saying that they support Anthropic's right in this particular situation to contest the government's decision. But overall, the future is going to be deeply embedded, very powerful AI systems in all of our national security apparatus, intelligence, community defense, and diplomatic.
So let me just follow up on this, because what's interesting about the Anthropic situation is the competitive environment they're operating in. So they step out, OpenAI steps in. Not clear that the agreement that OpenAI came to was any different than what Anthropic got. But even leaving that aside, there's always going to be, or many times there will be a US company who will be willing to do something that you as a company won't do. Or if we were in the international context, there's a Chinese company that'll jump in that has fewer safeguards. So really, is this whole conversation about governance regulation irrelevant? Because as long as there's somebody out there who can develop something and they're willing to sell it, there will be a buyer for that.
So there's two components of this. One is, what is the level of justified confidence in a system's reliability? And in that sense, competitive dynamics to rush products into applications, there's going to be a natural governor, which is performance and confidence. And the second one is a larger, more abstract problem for the national security community, which is around what is the appropriate normative framework for the applications of these AI systems. So the one place where the United States and China agreed at a normative level that AI applications should not be employed is in nuclear command and control decisions. And so everybody says, well, yeah, it seems like a pretty good idea that we shouldn't automate those decisions. And so therefore, there will be certain subsets of AI applications where competitive dynamics are not going to be a race to the bottom. There is a separate set of national security risks where I think a large group of people who are concerned in legitimate ways with national security are worried, and that is in the inadvertent escalatory dynamics that could emerge when automatic system faces automatic system in an uncertain, open environment. And that is where probably the models and analogies from arms control eras will come into play as these advanced systems get employed in complicated command and control systems. But I don't think, Chris, it's going to be commercial competitive dynamics racing us forward. I think it's going to be once these systems start to interact and we get a few really worrisome examples of potential escalation that is inadvertent. So for instance, we didn't get serious about nuclear arms control with the Soviets until after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it takes some certain level of real world experience before countries start to take these things seriously, even if intellectually and intuitively they understand the risk.
I want to give everyone a heads up. We're going to move to audience questions shortly. If people want to ask questions, there's a mic over there. Feel free to start queuing up. Alan, I want to ask you a question that I didn't prep you for, but I know you can answer this question. So we've talked about the struggles of government to regulate the development of AI. What about the impacts of AI? I think a lot about globalization and what that did for worker displacement. Should government be doing more to anticipate what that is like? Or I think about social media, where we've often talked about we should have gotten ahead of this earlier. Now that we don't, you see governments like Australia saying, well, we're going to have age limits for people using social media. Is that the best we can do at this point, anticipate what the impacts are and try to regulate those impacts?
I think it's probably worse than that. Not to be the pessimist in the room, but again, it's such a variegated technology landscape. You know, we could be talking about self-driving cars, we could be talking about within the automobile, a bunch of different sort of machine learning or AI-related features. But I think the big thing that's out there are the large language models. You know, that there's the concern of generalized intelligence, or as Dario Amodei said in an interview a couple of weeks ago, he said, you know, essentially 100 Einsteins in a box. I think that's the thing that concerns many people the most outside of domain-specific ones. But as Seth said, in many ways, that horse has left the barn. And so how we're going to regulate, so you can have a large language model now run on your own desktop. It has to be a pretty sophisticated desktop, and it's not the most sophisticated model out there. But if this is as bad as it's ever going to be, I think the thing that's really different today is nobody was going to build a nuclear bomb at home. It requires an enormous plant. It requires all these kinds of things. Anyone in this room could build an agent on their desktop today that could pose an extraordinary security threat to the internet, to the network system that they're connected to. And they wouldn't have to be a particularly skilled person to do it because it's all driven by natural language. How we're going to regulate that, I think, is wildly uncertain because, and again, I agree with Seth, there's lots of areas where it's just going to be domain specific, where the manufacturers or whoever delivers the service or product will have coordination type interests of regulation of that type. You know, so that, you know, we see this already emerging with things like MCP protocols coming out and companies coming together saying, yeah, we're going to coordinate how we deliver a service that way. But the competitive dynamic between the United States and China over building the foundational models I don't see any restraint on that post some disaster or near disaster like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Well, we've got students lined up or people lined up. Let's go to the questions. Why don't you introduce yourself first and ask the question, and then you could either direct it to the panelists or we'll just have whoever wants to answer. Please, go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you for your time today. My name is Bennett Bruner. I'm a second-year history major. My question's for the panel, but it comes from Professor Stam's comment about kind of this fear or lower usage of these AI models that we see in certain parts of society. My question is, do you think that these people that you're mentioning that aren't using these AI models is out of a lack of accessibility, or are there other factors for why they're not having as much use of AI, whether that be, general societal fears or maybe even limitations on their job?
Probably a little bit of all of the above, but there's definitely, sort of a class of people in society that are forward-looking and embrace technology, and then there's a group of people that tend to say, hey, what we've got right now is pretty good. So there were early adopters of social media, there were early adopters of these technologies, plural. So you see people embracing Tesla vehicles with full self-driving, and there's other people that would say, I'll never get in one of those. Accessibility certainly plays a role, but I don't think that's the big driver of it. I think it's personal preferences.
Thank you. Why don't you queue up, and let me ask you a question from the audience, from the online audience. And I think I know what the answer is going to be to this, but I'll ask it anyway. Senator Sanders has called for a moratorium on AI development. Would you please address the feasibility of such a moratorium? Does anyone think that's feasible?
I think when the leading proponents of many of the most advanced AI companies tried to come up with a moratorium idea early on, 2 years ago now, that was the high watermark of the moratorium effort.
I mean, even if one had a moratorium in the United States,
And
I don't think China's stopping.
since then, we have gone in the opposite direction.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, please.
So, as you pointed out, Google has been a big driver of open source for the positive. The flip side, though, there is a risk associated with open sourcing everything. What are your thoughts about that? About, how do we think about managing the benefits and risks of the open source approach versus saying, no, we should close it down?
I think it's really important we're all talking about this. I mean, that technology at its best has the capacity to democratize access to information and benefits. So you don't have to study at UVA to get presidential history. You can get that sitting in Kenya because of the, and AI has all these incredible benefits, but we have to make them accessible to everyone. And open source is one way to do that, that developers can build off of Android, Google's open source model. So I think agent protocols, which you mentioned, are a perfect example where we want agents to be able to work across airline apps, Uber, delivery apps, all your different apps, but how do you do that and let new players come in and have it be secure? You want to have the security standards along with open source. I think looking back, the debate open versus you can't have open and have secure, I think is a false narrative. I think you can have open and have secure. Arguably, open can lend to better security benefits. I think looking ahead, it's something we all need to keep thinking about. And as we see the potential for really bad actors to use this technology, how do we keep that balance? And it might be that there's categories of AI that are open source because they're lower risk, and categories that are the frontier models, for example, aren't open source. So that might be, I'm not saying that's the right answer there, but just it could be case by case. But I think we should all be thinking about it, so thank you for the question.
Hey, thank you for joining us. My name is Adisu Manasi. I'm a foreign affairs major. One of you guys mentioned about the cost of AI data centers earlier, and I want to ask questions about recently some members of Congress were sharing their frustration over AI data centers, potential overuse of local community, power grid, making electrical bills goes higher.
And as you know, recently the president announced an initiative where AI data centers owners have to create their own self-sufficient power grid in order to, in response to this issue. So it looks like it brings a benefit to both sides, but how do you guys see this new initiative? Thank you. Appreciate it.
People want to address data centers, energy, water.
I mean, I'm happy to say that, we've run data centers for a long time and have not at this level of investment. And so we have committed to paying our own electricity costs, doing this, building data centers responsibly. Since 12 years I've been at Google, Google has been committed to 100% carbon-free and 100% renewable data center in terms of the offsets. So I think this is a really important, people are asking about it, and we should continue to have the conversation, and I think it's good the companies are agreeing to pay their own electricity.
I will also say this
prices.
is a very salient issue here in Virginia,
Yeah,
which is essentially the data center capital.
Yeah.
Virginia is a net importer of energy right now, in part because of data centers. And while they do create some jobs, they tend not to be sustainable jobs. It's jobs in the construction. So and yet there's a race for states to get as many data centers as possible, but there's not really the capacity on the energy at the point. Want to go to the next question?
Hi, my name is Jason. I'm a fourth-year computer engineer, so I know less about the governance side of things, but I'm trying to learn. Thank you guys all for coming here. My question's a two-parter. The first one's pretty quick, though. First, out of the 535 Congress members, could you guys take a guess at how many have STEM degrees? Because I read about this last night, and I was
Have what?
flabbergasted.
Oh, STEM degrees.
STEM degrees, yes.
STEM degrees.
Wasn't
do you mean
it
by-
like 3 or 5 or something like that?
5.
Oh, no, it's higher than that.
Was it-
I mean, it's less than 100. I'm going to say it's a couple dozen, maybe.
Yeah, it's 25,
Yeah, okay.
if I'm not mistaken. So I was astounded by this. To what extent should I be worried about that? Because it feels like we need people with technical grounding, actually making policies. Should I be worried about this, or are things under control?
Well, I know Austria and I both have law degrees. Seth is a historian, and
We're all in
Seth and
trouble.
Alan have PhDs, and so none of us have STEM degrees, and we're all opining here on governance
No, I
issues.
mean, I have a lot of faith in our ability of, we've been in government. From what I saw in government, of policymakers' ability to regulate things they're not experts in. And, but I do think we need to have more conversations about the actual products and how to use them. And I think chatbots are one thing, but the multimodal element of AI, the video, is it going to be even language models that we're talking about, world models? I think we need to find ways for policymakers to be informed about the products so that they can make good policy. So I think places like UVA can play a big role in that too.
You raise a good question, though. Where do policymakers draw expertise from to generate the confidence to make judgments on the basis of technical requirements? And if that technical expertise does not reside in the government, not just in the legislative branch, but in the executive branch, then you are dependent on industry. That is a challenge. So in national security, you might be able to draw the national labs for expertise, right? The problem that we had over the last couple of years, 3 or 4 years in AI specifically, and particularly as large language models became the prevailing technological paradigm that we were worried with from a policy perspective, was most of the large language development did come out of the private sector, and we did not have that many people with the technical literacy within the national labs, within the science agencies to help. And so there's going to have to be an effort, and there is to a certain extent an effort, to bring in enough expertise to help inform policymakers so they aren't beholden to industry for technical judgments. Because otherwise, you're stuck as a policymaker trying to figure out which expert in which industry is telling you the right information. That's not where you want to end up in a democracy.
Let's get the next question.
Hello, I'm Barrett. I'm a fourth-year History, Law, and Society major. So I have a couple of questions, actually.
Can we just actually do like literally, we want to get to as many people as possible, so why don't you pick one?
Okay. Given that's the case, a lot of things brand themselves as AI without actually being large language models. Do you think that poses a risk to confusing the market and diluting it?
Do you mean a risk to like the stock market or regulators?
Well,
or?
I guess just in general, we're trying to pass policies or,
Yeah.
preventing it, but there's a lot of discussion about AI laws, but a lot of things are being branded AI, of which many of them are not large language models. And so is that going to confuse people? Is that going to lead to things not really going smoothly like maybe they should?
I mean, I'll ask you this, Austria. I mean, when I do a Google search and the algorithm moves something up to the top based on either something I've looked at or whether people look, that's AI.
It's using AI,
When
absolutely.
Google Maps tells me how long it's going to take to drive from here to here,
Yeah.
that's AI. But we don't think about that in the kind of the insidious way that we think about
I mean,
other-
and I think generative AI is one kind of AI. I mean, I think that you're right, and this is kind of what I was alluding to a moment ago with video and world models that aren't necessarily based on language. I think that we should be precise when talking about how we regulate chips or data centers or the kind of privacy or the kind of protections we need for health versus other kinds of AI. That AI is a lot of things, and so I think that's why it's important to have these conversations. And I think right now there's a lot of fear because AI is a label for a lot of things, but I think it's really important to have precise conversations. And I think we can do hard things and have those conversations at a big level, but also specific. And so that's why it's a good question and a good point.
Okay, thank you.
Other thoughts? The other point I'd add to this, and we talk about potential biases in AI, and the point I always make is compared to what? If we use AI to do review of resumes or to do initial interviews of people, there is going to be biases built into that, but we know that humans doing it have some level of biases as well. So I think we really need to level set what exists now and what the potential harms are.
But I mean, I think very high number of companies in the Fortune 500 Walmart calls itself an AI company, and Walmart's been doing unbelievable things with AI. So this is why I come back to the electricity analogy. That's just my personal. It's like the underlying technology. It's a set of technologies. It's not just one thing. So I think that helps me think about it.
Yeah, thank you. Next question.
Hi, my name is Lucy Robb, and I'm a first-year majoring in government and global sustainability. I had a question about AI in the environment as well, and I was wondering, in terms of policy specifically, do you think there's an effective way to balance environmental regulations and technological innovation?
Anybody?
I do. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I think I'm not an expert at all of this. But some of the use cases that I have heard about for AI that are most exciting actually relate to the environment, flood prediction. And we are working with a number of governments, and this is why I think partnership with government, with the companies, not just on the policies, that's a really important part of the conversation, but many governments are charging ahead using AI. So they might not have passed laws about it, but they are using it, whether it's to manage traffic, predict floods, predict wildfires. And so I think there are environmental outcomes AI can help achieve because it's fundamentally analyzing data much faster and seeing patterns than any human ever could. So that is, I think, a huge use case that we should all talk about when we think about what AI can do.
Can I ask the rest of the panel this question? I mean, and Seth, I'll go to you because this is an issue we dealt with at the United Nations. In the world right now, there's maybe a couple dozen countries that really have the capability, the technological capability to do frontier AI development. And this debate about governance will affect every other country in the world, for good and bad, whether it's having access to applications like flood prediction or the downside of AI-created disinformation that will affect their elections. I mean, what obligations does that give us as a developed country to try to get these rules right? Because if we get it wrong, that will affect everyone else.
Well, I think the answer is we have a massive obligation. Not only an obligation, but I think it's in our national interest to get these right. It's in our national interest and it's in our commercial interest. It's in our commercial interest because we're going to generate justified confidence in our companies being responsible, having the right rules, and when countries make choices about what models they adopt, whether it's for government efficiency or whether it's in their telecom network or whether it's for an enterprise in a national oil company, they're going to make an assessment of what global companies providing AI models that are going to be integrated into their complex systems are going to work well and work in ways that are predictable and work in ways that are transparent and work in ways that they're going to have confidence in. And so there's an inseparability of the national interest component, the responsibility as a nation component of this moving forward. And I think there's an interesting dynamic here. We haven't talked a lot about the developing world. What's interesting when we have conversations about AI safety and risk in the developing world is oftentimes they would have much less confidence in their own government regulating AI than a company governing AI responsibly. This is something that is very hard for us in the United States or in a European context to keep in mind. And it was something that surprised many of us as we had these conversations. And that's why, in some sense, there was more comfort with the voluntary, slower path to regulation in much of the world than there was in the United States.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, my name's Owen. I'm a second year studying, I don't really know right now, but economics, I guess. My question is directed at Ms. Van Dyke. So, as a consumer, I kind of faced with the choice to trust Google. You know, I pretty much have to take Google's word for what they say, and especially as we get into the point of, rapid AI development. There's a lack of regulation. I even more have to take what Google has to say. Is there any proof, anything beyond just your word that proves that we should trust Google? Is there any public-facing initiatives or, any other programs that could prove that we should trust you, that you have our best interests in mind?
Well, I mean, what I would say is,
I trust you, Oscar.
it's not about me personally. I mean, I think it is from where I sit, it is a fiercely competitive market right now, and every day we have to earn the trust of our users, and so, and that has been true for a while at Google. I mean, Amazon, Facebook, Meta, TikTok, now OpenAI, Claude, Anthropic. There are a lot of other players people can go to get information. Microsoft go to get information. So we have to earn users' trust, and we take that very seriously. And I think we're also a public company that has shareholders and have to, file SEC filings, and so we are regularly testing our products. We run thousands of tests on search a year so search being our main product, to check its reliability, its relevance. I was just I'm in Charlottesville for the day. I live in Washington. But if it had given me answers, I put in coffee shop in Washington, that wouldn't have been helpful to me. I needed it in Charlottesville. So, we're regularly running tests to make sure our products are useful to people, and we are a business. But that business does involve the trust of our users. So all I can say is it's a market imperative that we feel every day.
Yeah. Great. Next question. We've got about 9 minutes. We'll see how many more questions we can get to.
So my question relates to local land use regulation. Specifically, there was the discussion of physical infrastructure relating to AI, like data centers. And so in the discussion of fragmented regulation, should we see it as problematic that a lot of these decisions are being made on a county-by-county basis? And there's a lot of devolution of land use regulation to local government, and so is that problematic in terms of creating like a coherent policy for AI's physical infrastructure?
So it's a massive problem if you believe that 2 large states are competing for the future, and the race to large language models that are going to lead to AGI, that are going to have all kinds of benefits for national security and economy, is the orienting principle. Then we have a massive national problem reflected in how you're characterizing this because it reflects how you would build large compute infrastructure that's going to build the next several generations of models, presumably. China has a much more enabling environment. They do have a much more enabling environment. They also can rely on coal and whatever else they want to generate inefficient model training. And so this has been something that both the Biden administration and the Trump administration have been working extremely hard on. And what I think you're alluding to is the fact that there is basically, you run up against the limits of federal power, not energy, but federal authority to deal with this problem. And so now I think what is happening is, one, there's going to be a concentration of investment in compute infrastructure in the places in the country that are most permissive. And so you're seeing an interesting shift in where the infrastructure is being built on the basis not of where it might naturally go, but on the basis of a regulatory regime that is more permissive for these huge infrastructure build-outs. Is that the efficient, optimized national approach to doing this? No. But it's both the commercial and national imperative that is driving it in that direction.
Thank you so much.
Alan, thoughts on this local
Yeah,
government?
so the only thing I would say is I think one of the potential sort of costs of that are, depending on one's perspective, totally trivial, and depending on another perspective, huge, is latency problem. You know, if you don't have a data center physically co-located with your users are, you're going to have some latency issues. There are going to be service provision issues. I think the flip side is, though, if the people that reside in a county don't want a data center in their county, they should have the ability to say, no, I don't want a data center in our county. And as long as across the country as a whole, there are sufficient numbers of counties that say, yeah, we'd like the economic opportunity that goes along with that, I think in the aggregate, it's a good thing.
So there's an interesting dynamic here, which is other countries are now starting to make the pitch, you know this from the Google perspective, that, oh, you guys have energy problems, you guys have permitting problems, you guys have times energy problems, why don't you come build here? Why don't you, we'll give you all the power you need. You don't have to worry about permitting here. And so there's a global economic challenge that is presented as the complexity of these local issues become international issues. I'm not saying that should drive decision making, but it is starting to emerge if one thinks about this in terms of the international economics of this as well.
But there's also, I think, to the land use issue, I think there's this interesting dynamic because we do make land use decisions at the local level. So if Loudoun County wants to develop data centers, Dominion Power doesn't operate just in Loudoun. Dominion actually operates in all of Virginia. The transmission system in Virginia is not a Virginia system. It's like an East Coast system. So you could have Loudoun County making decisions that overstrain what Dominion can do or what the transmission system can do, which then has effects on those counties that didn't want the data center. So yes, please go ahead.
In politics and media. And globalization was mentioned briefly, but just specifically a little bit about the Global South. Things keep growing, things are gonna change a lot. But beyond accessibility, when you think about like disproportional impacts in the Global South, whether that's environment or like chip mining, like sub-Saharan Africa, are any of these kind of disproportional impacts present in policy regulation conversations? Or is there any responsibility from Silicon Valley as things change in that regard too?
Why don't we hold, I'm going to ask the next two, ask your questions quickly, and then we'll ask the panelists, they can answer one of the three. Go ahead. So that one is on Global South, minerals. Go ahead, mining.
Hi, Maxwell, fourth year economics and music major. You guys talked briefly about job replacement, and I was wondering if one of you guys could talk about your thoughts on redistribution policy, what you think might need to be done in the future if AGI happens, there's massive unemployment and job replacement, how might redistribution policy might be able to factor that in?
Okay, we'll take the last question.
Hi, I'm Adrian. Thank you so much for coming. On some similar subjects to the last two speakers, I know we talked about principles, and as much as I love them, it seems like there might be a situation where there needs to be more hardcore international cooperation. Do you see any sort of logic of having a floor to this competition, especially as it becomes more pertinent to national security? Thank you.
So we've got about 4 minutes. Let me start with Alan. You can answer any of these three questions, and we'll go down this way.
I'll take the last one, no. I think the technology is changing so fast and the competitive pressures and imperatives are so great, it seems very unlikely that these foundation models will be regulated anytime soon.
Seth, you want to
The
answer one?
Global South question is an excellent one. The concern that we heard most often was about data exploitation. In other words, how does one get value from local or national data that would go into an international company or a US company's model and is trained on that local data and then brought back into the country in a way that's optimized for the local conditions, but in which the profit then is extracted back to the company. That's something I think that every US company deals with on a national level around the world. But I would say, by and large, most of the developing world is far more concerned with being bypassed in the AI revolution than getting exploited through the AI revolution. They believe that the digital divide exacerbated a whole series of inequalities in the past 2 decades, and they would very much prefer, generally, not to be left behind. And that means they have taken, and this is part of the reason why there's far more optimism in the developing in the world than there is in the West.
Astrid?
Well, job displacement, I think it's such an important question. And job change AI has already significantly changed my job for the better. And I think when we look at the history of technology development, there's been jobs lost, there's been jobs changed, and there's been jobs gained. I think that the stat is that 60% of the jobs in the US today didn't exist 80 years ago. So over the course of history, technology has led to new jobs and change in jobs much more than it has destroyed jobs. Now, that's not a comfort to someone who loses their job because of AI. And so I think the future here, I think if anyone says they know exactly how AI is going to affect certain jobs, I just don't think that's true. I really don't think we know. So to where you were going, policies, governments are considering what to do. What we are trying to do from our end is have partnerships with universities, with governments around what kind of skills are going to be needed in the AI economy. And we just introduced a certificate for small businesses to become AI certified so that they can have the skills to grow their businesses in the AI era. So what we can offer are training programs, making sure universities have real insights into what employers need in the AI era. I mean, what employers need might be different than 5 years ago. And so that needs to be a really ripe conversation that involves many players, and I think universities can play a big role. But it's a really important question that I think is top of mind for a lot of people, which is good. And it's hard to manage in the face of uncertainty, but that's why we all need to be at the table talking about it.
I will add my thoughts and then wrap up here, I think, on the job loss situation. And the globalization example is an interesting one, because in globalization, we largely lost low-wage, low-skilled jobs. I don't think that's going to be the case with AI. I mean, 10 years ago, we used to tell young people to go be coders. Nobody's telling you to be a coder now. I think about at the United Nations, one of the hardest, highest paying jobs is to be an interpreter, because the UN operates in 6 languages. Google Translate's pretty good. And the new Apple AirPods can do simultaneous translation. That's a high-skilled, high-wage job that's going to disappear. And if the lesson we learn from globalization is this, if we don't figure out what that means economically, there are going to be big political repercussions down the road from that. Well, look, clearly this is the beginning of a long conversation, and I think if we've learned anything, there's not an easy answer to this question of AI governance. But also know that this is not a conversation that's going to be limited to what's happening in Silicon Valley, the conversations in Washington or other places. It's really, as Emmett said at the outset, it's a conversation that places like UVA, the students in the room, can really help shape. So we appreciate you being part of this. We're going to be doing more meetings like this at the Miller Center. But please join me in thanking the panelists for their insights today.